co-founded the well-known Carpenter's Boat Shop on Pemaquin Point. You may also remember from his last Winter Wisdom talk in 2014, he came to Pemaquin to start the boat shop in 1979 from Monhegan Island, where he and Ruth were teachers and Bob was minister of the churches on Monhegan, Louds, and Matinicus Islands. Looking back still further, Bob became a minister by earning a Master of Divinity at Edinburgh University, and that's how he became involved with another island called IONA. IONA, as we'll soon learn, is off the west coast of Scotland, a remote and beautiful area near the islands of Mull and Skye. Bob attended Bowdoin College, graduating in 1969, and came to the ministry through a family legacy of ministers, including his grandfather, his brothers, his father, and his grandmother, Hilda Libby Ives, who was the first ordained woman minister in the state of Maine. When Bob retired from the boat shop in 2012, he returned to his alma mater as the first ever Director of Religious and Spiritual Life at Bowdoin College. From this, he retired just last year, returning to his love of teaching at the boat shop. Phyllis Lockhart Ives, did I pronounce that right? Was not born in Maine, but in New Jersey, where she lived and attended the University of New Jersey, graduating in 1971. Her family legacy, however, originates in Pemaquin Point. It was in the 1600s that the Lockhart family began homesteading right across the Pemaquin River from the Carpenter's Boat Shop. After graduating from the university, Phyllis began a distinguished career in public relations, marketing, and strategic planning throughout the U.S., but most specifically at Baylor University in Texas. She returned to her roots in 1999 and began her own company called Lockhart Associates. She has been active in spearheading a capital campaign throughout Europe and the U.S. for the IONA Abbey and that community. Bob and Phyllis were married in 2010, and we're delighted to welcome them here today.
Well, I'd like to, can you hear me okay? Is it too loud, too soft, too anything? Great, well, welcome to each and every one of you, and on behalf of Phyllis and me, we'd like to not only welcome you, but thank you all very, very much for coming to this particular talk on the island of Iona. Special thanks also to Reg for the gracious kind of introduction, and...
A little loud.
Too loud?
A little bit.
You soften that up a little bit? Do I...
Say go in the back of the room. Take it back.
Lower this thing. Lower one. Well, wave if you can't hear me, and if it's too loud, just kind of put your fingers in your ears. Okay, so again, thanks to Reg, and thanks to Reg also for inviting Phyllis and me to come to be with you today to speak about a topic that is very dear and very special to us, namely the Isle of Iona. But before we get underway, let me just get a little survey here. How many of you have been to Scotland? Holy cow. How many of you have been to Iona? Oh, wow. Well, I'm preaching to some of the choir. But I actually promise I won't preach to you today. I'll spare you all that. But I would actually like to begin today, inasmuch as the Isle of Iona is the sacred island of Scotland, I'd like to begin with a passage of Scripture. And the passage of Scripture comes to us from the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. And inasmuch as there are an awful lot of shepherds who live out on the Isle of Iona, I'd like to read from Exodus about the life of a shepherd by the name of Moses. Now Moses was tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. When the Lord saw that Moses turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, saying, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Then God said, Put off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. The land on which you are standing is sacred ground. So today, Phyllis and I would like to share with you a little bit about a place that for us is holy ground, sacred ground. Namely, the Isle of Iona, the sacred island of Scotland, the island of monks and ministers and missionaries, the island of St. Columba. So let's get underway and start by asking some of the very basic and foundational questions about the island of Iona. Namely, not very clear, but namely, where is Iona? Well, indeed, it's off the coast of Scotland. Let's see how to work this. Here's Scotland, of course. Scotland is about the same size as the state of Maine. Britain's about the same size as, of course, New England. And here's the east coast of Scotland, Edinburgh. Here's Glasgow over there. And there's little Iona right there, about halfway up the west coast of Scotland. If I were to enlarge the whole area there on the west coast, here's the mainland, here are all the islands. These are the inner Hebrides, there are the outer Hebrides. What does the word Hebrides mean? It's a Gaelic word. And, of course, in Scotland, they speak 3 different languages. Ever since 1707, when Scotland merged with England, they've been speaking English. But they still also speak 2 other languages, 2 ancient Celtic languages. The first is Scots, or Scottish. The second is Gaelic. In Ireland, it's called Gaelic. In Scotland, it's called the Gaelic. And the word Hebrides is a Gaelic word, which means Heb, island, Brides, Bridget. The islands of St. Bridget. Bridget was, of course, the 5th century saint, and patron saint of Ireland, and also a patron saint of Scotland as well. And indeed, the island of Iona is in the Hebridean Islands there. It's right there off of the island of Mull, one of the inner Hebrides. 75 miles to the north is the Isle of Skye, and 75 miles to the south, which is here, is the country of Ireland. Due south. It's interesting. You'd think it would be kind of more easterly. Anyway, so there's little Iona. So the next question before us is, how do you get there? Well, I remember, that's a good picture, isn't it? Anyway, I remember going there many, many years ago, because there are all different kinds of ways to get there. I remember going there with the Outward Bound program, a Scottish Outward Bound program. We sailed around Mull and all these different kinds of places and islands, but we sailed to Iona as well. But the traditional way of going to Iona is by going to the harbor town of Oban. Very beautiful little fishing community, harbor town, and you take a ferry. Scottish, it's called Caledonia McBrain Ferry. Caledonia is the ancient name for Scotland. The Scots never called their country Scotland. They didn't call themselves Scots. It was the Romans who did that. Rather, they called themselves the Caledonians, or Caledonia, and these islands out here were called Dalriada. But in any event, you go to Oban Harbor, you take a ferry about an hour's journey, maybe 10 miles, to the northeast corner of the island of Mull, a little town called Craignure, and then you take, let's see here, a one-track road. There's your road. 40 miles, one-track road, along the coast and through the island of Mull, to the southwest corner, to a lovely little fishing community called Finneport. And from Finneport, you take another ferry 2 miles across. There we go. Let's go back. What have I done? Anyway, so here we're taking the ferry across to the island of Iona, and that's what it looks like on the Finneport side, and this is what it looks like on the Iona side. So what does the island actually look like? So if you were to go to the highest place on the island, it's called Dunedin. Dunedin is, again, a Gaelic word, Dun meaning hill, E meaning Iona. About 330 feet high, and if you were to look to the east, you'd see this view here. Here is, let's do this again. Here is the actual abbey and cathedral there. Here's the Sound of Iona. Here's little Finnefort village there, Mull, and then Scotland in the distance. If you were to look to the north, you'd see this scene. Here are the, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is too tricky. This is too tricky. Let's see. Oh, I see. I got you. So I should have had practice on this whole thing. Anyway, so this is looking to the north. These are the Inner Hebrides here. Here's the island of Staffa there. Here's a very beautiful little pool of water called the Pool of St. Bridget, or the Pool of Eternal Youth. Tradition says that if you drink that water and splash a little water in your face, you will have eternal youth. But between me and thee, I don't believe it for a moment. You see, I was there almost 50 years ago, and I did just that. I drank the water, I put a little in my face, and I venture to say I look a lot more like a 71-year-old man than a 23-year-old boy, which is what I was when I first was there. Plus, I really wouldn't drink that water anyway. You see, the two principal occupants of the island who drink most of it are the sheep and the cows. If you were to look to the south, you would see this, the Columba Bay, because tradition says when St. Columba came from Ireland to bring Christianity to Scotland through the island of Iona, he landed there on the south coast called Columba Bay with all the very beautiful heather all around. And if I were to look to the west, this is the scene I would see. This is called the Macker here. A beautiful kind of area. Macker is another Gaelic word meaning pasture land or the sheep land. Always surrounded by these beautiful white sandy beaches that circumnavigate the entire island. Always, again, right there in the foreground, the beautiful granite cliffs that are there. So the island of Iona is like a little jewel, about 3.5 miles long, about 1.5 miles. So who are the island's residents? Well, you're looking at the majority. There are between 1,000 and 2,000 sheep all over this little tiny island. And the sheep are everywhere. I mean, they're there on the shore, they're there on the pasture lands, they're there on the hillsides, and they're there where they shouldn't be. Walking on the walls between the pastures. And who are the other major residents? Well, there they are there. All those woolly creatures named the Highland cattle. And the Highland cattle, of which there are probably 500 to 700 cows on the island as well, they're everywhere too. They're there in church on Sunday, and they're there on the golf course on Monday and Friday. And as I say, they're everywhere. And indeed, there actually is a golf course out on the island. It's an 18-hole golf course that's maintained by the people at the abbey and the cathedral. And they mow the greens about once a month. And they mow the pastures with the sheep and the cows. And actually, the tradition is if you play golf there or play tournament golf there, you have to play around all the impediments and the obstacles on the course. The chief ones being sheep, cows, and what they call cow ploppies. So why is the island called Iona? Well, etymologically, there are many different reasons offered, but the most cogent among them for me is that the word Iona and the word Jonah are one and the same word. You see, in the Gaelic language, I and J are the same. So Iona and Jonah are the same. And the word Jonah, in the Hebrew language, means dove of peace. Not just that, but also the one who comes to Scotland, namely St. Columba. The word Columba in the Latin language also means dove of peace. So the one who is the dove of peace, Columba, comes to the island of peace, Iona, and indeed, whenever people see a dove around, they always feel as if the presence and the spirit of Columba are still in their midst. So why is Iona called the sacred island of Scotland? Well, basically it's because of the 70 to 75 different kings and queens of Scotland. 48 of them are buried right there in the ancient cemetery of Iona. 48 of the kings and queens of Scotland are buried right there. But not just that. Also, there are 7 kings of Norway who are buried there, as well as 18 different tribal chiefs and kings of Ireland who are buried there. Why? Because of this person right there, Saint Columba. So who was Columba? What's his legacy and his history? Well, Columba was born in 521. He was born in Donegal, Ireland. He was the son of a tribal chief who eventually became, his father became, the king of Northern Ireland. But when Columba was a very young person, he decided to become a monk. He attached himself to a monastery called Clonard under the abbotship of a man named Finian, who eventually became Saint Finian. And he participated fully in the regular events of an Irish monastery, working and worship, prayer, and study. But at a very young age, he himself went off and began 2 other monasteries in Northern Ireland, one of which came to be known as one of the most famous monasteries in all of Ireland, the monastery called Kells, about 40 miles north of Dublin. But at the age of 42, Columba decided he would leave his native land and go to a new land to share his faith, his life, with people of the new land called Caledonia, Dalriada, eventually Scotland. And so in 563, in the month of June, he set off in a vessel called a coracle or a cora, a kind of oxhide cover, wicker frame kind of sailing vessel. He left with 12 other monks, and together they set sail in June of 563, and in June 9th, 563, they arrived on the south shore of the island of Iona to share their faith, their lives with the people of that new land. The first thing they did was to build a monastery. Look. It wasn't this one. This one would not be built for another 600 years after Columba. But indeed, the monastery that they did build would have been just to the north of this actual monastery. And, oh dear, these things are pretty tricky here. The monastery that they built, you can see the remnants of it right in here. It's that ditch which they call a vallum, and the monastery was right in this area, and archaeological evidence has shown that that's where the original monastery of Columba actually was. And his monastery would have probably looked like a traditional ancient Irish monastery. Always built in kind of a circular fashion like this, symbolizing eternal life, eternal peace, eternal love. Always they had round circular houses in which the monks lived, made out of wood and wattle, wattle being a kind of plaster made of all kinds of elements from mud to dung to whatever they had in that way, and to anything to keep cold air out and whatever heat they had within. Always built around a sanctuary or a chapel or eventually a cathedral of some sort. And the basic life of the Irish monks and Columba as well would have been to share in working and worship, prayer and study, as well as 2 principal vocations. The first of their principal vocations was to transcribe the Scriptures, to copy the Scriptures over and over again. Long before printing press of the 16th century came out in the 6th century, they were simply hand-writing all of the Scriptures into documents which would be called Celtic manuscript illumination. In other words, every Bible, every book of the Bible, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, always began with these beautiful symbolic pictures, again called Celtic manuscript illumination, symbolizing what was in the contents of the Scriptures themselves. So they would copy those scriptures over and over again, making these beautiful pictures. And then the second vocation was to carry them into the land of Scotland, to share them with the Picts and the Scots and the different individuals who lived within Scotland itself. And indeed, they did. They shared the scriptures, they shared their lives, and they began many other monasteries as well. This is the monastery called Lindisfarne on the east coast of Scotland. But Columba, throughout his life, began 7 different monasteries and places of worship in Scotland. He transcribed many scriptures, actually 300 different scriptures and theological writings. He wrote endless prayers and many hymns. But in 594, when he was 73 years of age, Columba died there on the island of Iona and was buried there. But fortunately, his monastery did not die. It continued on for about another 200 to 240 years. But in the 9th century, an event took place which dramatically changed the religious and the ecumenical and ecclesiastical life there in Scotland. It was called the Vikings. The Vikings had been coming into Scotland for 40 years before they came to Iona. They've been marauding and ransacking many different places on the mainland, but indeed around the year 794, they arrived on Iona. Tradition says that when they arrived, the monks went down to greet them and to share hospitality with them. And in turn, 84 monks were slaughtered on this beach in particular, now called Martyrs' Beach. And so, with the arrival of the Vikings, it really brought about the demise and the end of the Columban monastery there on Iona. The monks realized that life was not sustainable with this kind of difficulty. And so they literally packed up their Bibles, their manuscripts, their possessions, and they did return to Ireland. They returned to the monastery at Kells, which Columba himself had actually begun. And so those Bibles, those manuscripts, came to be known as the Book of Kells, which are now permanently preserved 1,400 years after they were originally written. They are now preserved not at Kells any longer, but now at Trinity College in Dublin. So the first chapter of our history of the monastery of Columba really comes to an end about the middle of the 9th century and would not arise again for another 300 to 350 years. But indeed, in the 13th century, starting in 1211, a group of Benedictine monks from the mainland of Scotland determined that they would rebuild the original abbey and monastery of St. Columba. And so in 1211, this group of Benedictine monks under the leadership of a man named Summerlin, he was the abbot, he was the son of the Duke of Argyll, and they moved out to Iona and they built this actual edifice. They didn't do it overnight. It took them over 40 to 50 years to build. Let's go back again. To build, okay, so here's the abbey, the actual monastic buildings. Here's the cathedral right here. And right in here is the little chapel of St. Columba. Because tradition says that is where Columba himself was actually buried on the island of Iona. So it's a magnificent structure, and indeed the Benedictines flourished there for about 300 to 350 years, building all kinds of beautiful granite, Celtic crosses, building this little chapel called the Relic Aurum, which is right by the actual ancient cemetery here. They built St. Ronan's nunnery there, and literally for 300 to 350 years they flourished and had a wonderful kind of ecumenical and ecclesiastical life. But then, in the 16th century, another event took place which dramatically changed the entire religious and spiritual life on Iona. It was called Protestant Reformation. Beginning in 1517 with Martin Luther, it spreads quickly through Germany, and then eventually Europe, 1530s, it comes into England, and in the 1560s, under the leadership of John Knox, who introduces the Presbyterian Church to Scotland, suddenly things changed dramatically. The Presbyterians did not smile warmly, or treat well anything to do with Catholicism. They literally ransacked many of the monasteries and the nunneries. They tore down many of the cathedrals, to the point that from the 17th to the 19th century, this is the way that poor little Iona looked for 200 years. And so on this very sad note, I will turn you over to my very joyful wife and beloved wife, who will now share with you the rest of the story.
He's a very hard act to follow. Okay, is this a little too loud? That's okay? Okay. I have a tendency to talk very confidentially. Okay, to go to the next phase of this, we've kind of got to go back for just a moment and start at the beginning. Columba was known for a number of prophecies, and this is probably the most well-known of those. Iona of my heart, Iona of my love, instead of monks' voices shall be lowing of cattle, but ere the world comes to an end, Iona shall be as it was. And so it was. The first part of this prophecy came true in the 1500s, and as Bobby said, the Catholic monasteries did not fare so well in Britain, and Iona was no exception. The monks of Iona were dispersed to abbeys in Ireland and Europe, and the nuns in the nunnery were left in peace, but they died off slowly, and then St. Ronan's nunnery crumbled, and that's the way it is when you go to Iona to see it today. And for the abbey itself, the buildings fell into disrepair, the high altar was in fragments, cows and horses and sheep wandered around the ruins. But even in that sad state, the abbey remained a place of inspiration and spirituality. It was still holy ground. Visitors kept coming, and the numbers were growing starting in the late 18th century. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the British writer and essayist, noticed, "That man is little to be envied whose piety would not grow warmer amongst the ruins of Iona." Sir Walter Scott, William Wordsworth, John Keats, Robert Louis Stevenson, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert all wrote about time spent on Iona. In 1829, Felix Mendelssohn, who spent quite a bit of time there, was coming home, and his sisters asked him what Iona was like. And he said, "It cannot be told, it can only be played." So he sat down at the piano and he played the theme that grew into this Hebrides overture, that bum, 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 bum. And he said, "When in some future time I shall sit in a madly crowded assembly with music and dancing around me, and the wish arises to retire into the loneliest loneliness, I shall think of Iona." So this is what it looked like about 1890, and people were still coming, and they were coming in again larger numbers. This is probably not an average day in 1890, but it's actually more than that, an average day today coming to the Abbey. But as the number of visitors and pilgrims started to increase, so did the interest in and the clamor really to start to do something about the Abbey ruins. Now the Abbey and the Isle of Iona and a whole lot of other things were the property of the Duke of Argyll. And at this point, it was the 8th Duke of Argyll, a man named George Douglas Campbell. And he, in 1899, he gifted the Abbey and the Relic Oran, and the nunnery as well, to the Church of Scotland. with the requirement that the Abbey Church be restored and that all branches of Christianity should be able to worship there, which may sound like a pretty normal thing to us, but back in 1899 that was truly revolutionary. There is also a story that he was concerned about his son and heir, who would become the 9th Duke of Argyll, who had a little drinking and gambling problem, and he wanted to get the Abbey someplace safe. So, by 1910, by 1910, the Abbey Church itself had been completely rebuilt. But the common areas, the common places where the monks lived, were still in ruins. So what was needed was a complete rebuilding. And then along comes this man, George MacLeod. In the words of people who loved and admired him, he was a conservative, radical, charismatic, impatient, imperious, romantic, iconoclastic, passionate man of oratory and action who, like Columba, could inspire others to join him on wild goose chase projects. The Most Reverend Lord Dr. George MacLeod was born into a distinguished family, educated at Winchester College in Oxford, and was decorated for bravery in World War I when he fought as an officer in a Highland regiment. But as a result of his war experiences, he became a dedicated pacifist, much to the chagrin of his family. So he gave up his military career and he went to seminary and became ordained into the Church of Scotland. And he accepted a call from the Govan Old Parish Church in a very poor section of Glasgow in the middle of the Great Depression. Now, Govan had been one of Britain's great shipbuilding centers, but now the yards were silent and the workers were trying to figure out how they were going to make ends meet. George MacLeod was appalled by the social deprivation in Govan, by the waste of human skills, by not having work, and most of all, by the church's lack of response. He became convinced that what was needed was a new experiment. He believed that people should have meaningful work, and he believed that ministers should understand and value working folk. So he devised a scheme for young ministers in training to be laborers for skilled craftsmen. Ministers would then be trained to be working in difficult places and be able to deeply appreciate all kinds of work. So George MacLeod went to the Church of Scotland trustees with this idea. And he got their tremendous enthusiastic support in all ways but financial. He had to go out and find the money. This was not a particularly encouraging thing for him because at this point he was not completely sold on the idea either, even if it was his. So that many years later he told this story. I wrote to the richest man I knew. He said, "You must be off your head." Then I wrote to the second richest man I knew, but he hasn't replied yet, and as this was 50 years ago, I don't suppose he will now. Then I wrote to Sir John Lithgow. I didn't know him well, but he had a shipbuilding yard right beside my parish church. I asked him for £5,000, which is the equivalent in today's money of 300,000. He built battleships, and I was a pacifist. I asked him because I thought he'd refuse, and that would be the end of my appealing and the end of the experiment. But instead he asked, if I give you £5,000, will you give up your pacifism? Not on your life, sir, he said. He said, I'll give you the £5,000. I was properly caught out and was now committed. And what he committed to was something really quite spectacular for someone who didn't have an awful lot of resources. Oops. This is the area that was rebuilt by the Iona Cathedral Trust in the very beginning. And this is the area that he undertook to rebuild. It was huge. And so it all began in July of 1938 when George MacLeod traveled by boat, as you have to, and arrived at Iona ready to go to work. He was 42 years old, exactly the same age as Columba was when he first arrived from Ireland more than 1,300 years before. Conditions were pretty rough in 1938 as well. The group built a small hut right over here. that would act as dormitory, sitting room, and dining room, and their life took on a Benedictine Columban rhythm with worship at the start and end of each day at the Abbey Church, which is, by the way, a practice that is still going on today. And their morning worship would just flow into the work of the restoration. Then they called themselves the Iona community. The community's relationship with the local islanders was mixed. Islanders, after all, would naturally consider themselves to be the Iona community, and who were these guys showing up to take the name? The Georges community men, and they were all men and they were all ministers in the very beginning, went out and they visited every single home on the island, and there were a lot of really good friendships that were made out of this, but there were still many people that were treating this whole thing with a lot of skepticism. As a matter of fact, there was one guy who wrote a letter to the Scotsman, which is an Edinburgh newspaper, asking, who were these ridiculous men spoiling the peace and beauty of the ruined abbey with a rotten hut? Furthermore, they hang out there washing on a Sunday, which you can see right there. Shortly after that, George got a letter from a lady that he didn't know, had never heard of, and she wrote, cleanliness comes next to godliness. She added that she had always hoped that the Iona Abbey would be rebuilt, and she enclosed a check for £10,000, the equivalent of 600,000 in today's money. And from then on, they hung their washing out on a Sunday without fail. This was not the only unusual thing that happened. The building did continue, but it was slowing down as World War II started to ramp up, and all the timber was requisitioned for war purposes. But then along comes a ship, not that one, but the ship from Canada, and it had a load on its decks of timber. And it came into the port of Glasgow, or it didn't quite get to Glasgow, right outside of the port. It hit a huge storm, and in order to save the ship, they had to throw the timber overboard. So the timber did this. It went down here, and around here, and up here, and it just happened to go into the Iona Sound, and it came to land right on the Isle of Mull, directly 1 mile across the Sound from the Abbey. And it was all the right length for what they needed to do next. So fortunately, the government had the wisdom to allow the Abbey to go ahead and use the timber, figuring that going up against George MacLeod and God was probably not going to be a good plan. So, and then the next thing that happened was, this ship still didn't come. It wasn't this ship from Norway, but it was because of this ship from Norway. There was a ship of this beautiful Scandinavian timber that showed up, and totally unexpectedly, and it turns out to be a gift from churches and businesses in Norway, because they had heard that the Iona Abbey was being restored, and they wanted to give this as reparation for the Viking raids 1,000 years earlier. So they had this beautiful timber that they could use. And then the last little story on this vein is about this. George MacLeod was walking down the street in London, and he saw this in a shop window, this beautiful big silver Celtic cross, and he thought that will be just the thing for the Abbey communion table. So we went in, and he asked the woman behind the counter, and she said, "I'm very sorry, sir, but that is not for sale. You see, my late husband heard that the Iona Abbey was being restored, and this can only go to the Abbey." He felt it would be just the thing. And so there it is. There it is on the Abbey communion table now. And there it rests today. So the war ended and the building kept on going. The number of pilgrims coming to Iona was steadily increasing, including Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh and Princess Margaret. And a lot of people wanted to help with the rebuilding. Some 3,000 people signed up as friends of the Iona community, supporting the experiment with their money. Now, I'm not sure how many of you might recognize this man here. This is Eamon de Valera. And he is one of the few leaders of the Irish Easter Rebellion in 1916 who survived the British execution squads. And he later became the president or the prime minister of the Irish Free State. He showed up on an unannounced visit to Iona, and George MacLeod happened to be there, so he took him around on a tour of the facilities. And as he was getting ready to leave, the prime minister asked the leader of the Iona community, is there anything I can do for you? And George MacLeod thought about that for a moment. He said, you could give us back the Book of Kells. So was it not brought here? Now there was like zero response to that. So in the silence he said that you could have the St. Martin's cross. You can have that in exchange. So De Valera finally decided to respond, and he said, you can have the Book of Kells for nothing on one condition, that you bring Iona into the Irish Free State. Not on your life, sir, was the reply. And as a result, for better or for worse, everything stayed where it was. So, but George's deal-making with the Irish Prime Minister was not quite over. About a year or so later, he had another idea. And he wrote, would you ever consider sailing on a carrack with me, sir, from Derry to Iona, when we all celebrate the 14th centenary of the arrival of St. Columba? I have a friend with a modern yacht that could sail in our wake and make transfer possible in the event of a storm. De Valera countered, bring your yacht, but she can sail ahead of the carrack in any storm they could transfer to our craft. So the 14th centennial of Columbus' arrival on Iona was celebrated 2 years later in 1963, fittingly on June 9th, which is St. Columba's Day. And there was a carrack that made the trip safely from Ireland to Iona, but neither one of those two guys were on it. But it was a historic moment. Although the restoration took another 2 years of work to really complete, the Abbey was officially celebrated as done and already building its new life into the 20th century. Because it wasn't just about restoring the Abbey. It became an experiment in community. Throughout the rebuilding, every year, men and women from almost every walk of life were drawn to Iona, working together on the walls, living together in very basic accommodations, sharing all the daily tasks of living, arguing, celebrating, praying, struggling with the issues of the day. And George MacLeod said, discovering year after year that only a demanding common task can create community. Now, up till this point, the Iona community had no official capacity at all on the island. They were just there rebuilding the Abbey. But at this point, they were invited to come on to the Iona Cathedral Trust. And so the representatives of the Iona community, the Church of Scotland, and the government, as represented by Historic Environment Scotland, now right through the current day, jointly are responsible for the care of the Abbey. The Iona community was specifically charged with conducting the year-round worship that had been promised to the Duke of Argyll almost 60 years before that. But they didn't limit their work just to church. The Iona community took up the mantle of St. Columba to offer a place not just of worship and inspiration, but of learning. One of the things that makes the Iona Abbey unique is the fact that it's a heritage site, but it is conducting its original purpose. It's still alive, doing the things that it was originally intended to do. It had been a place of learning and work and worship from the 6th century to the 16th, and now it was one again. And so the second part of Columbus' prophecy came true. But the key word here, as we go forward, is community. Today, the Iona community continues George MacLeod's experience. George MacLeod called it building community on modern materials, with modern materials on an old foundation. Every year now, some 3,000 men and women from every walk of life and from all corners of the world, believers and non-believers, come to the Abbey to share in the weekly demanding common task of breaking down barriers, living and learning together with a small residential staff and scores of volunteers, of which in 2012, Bobby and I were two. One of my, and the day is bookended with worship. There's worship at 9 a.m. and at 9 p.m. And then work flows, the worship flows direct smoothly into work. And anybody who is coming on the Isle of Iona is more than welcome to come to the Abbey for worship, and many, many people do. And you never know quite who you're going to be with when you're in an Iona program. So, this is the refectory where all the meals are served. And when you sit down at one of these tables for 10 people, you could be sitting with a professor of theology, a Catholic monk, a Quaker peace activist, a single parent with kids, an abuse survivor, an inner city gangbanger, and an army chaplain. You absolutely never know who you're going to be with. Community is pulled from all these different areas. And time again, visitors have said that they have gone back to their normal lives refreshed, inspired, and re-energized. In the words of one volunteer, people come to Iona looking for peace and quiet. They go away seeking peace and justice. This is a summary of the programs that were actually held last year to kind of give you a flavor of some of the things that are covered. The first one, the gathering space, just takes whoever comes. There are large groups, small groups, individuals who look into the Abbey on a given week, and they build community and assess ways that they could go back and work for issues that are important to them as individuals. Then there's a week on Celtic Christianity. There's a week on on some aspect of the situation in Israel and Palestine. There's a week on the issues for refugees and asylum seekers. There's a week on how do you go about appreciating other ways of meeting God that are not quite the same as what you are accustomed to. Another week that's specifically about the relationship between Christianity and Islam. Another week about change in the church. Another week about the environment, about protest in poetry and song, and about spirituality. These programs are run one a week, every week from March until October, through October into the season, and they are always run by either some member of the Iona community. And that's not all the Iona community does. They have a youth camp on the Isle of Mull, which is directly across from Iona, where kids from underprivileged areas of the UK can come and have a camp experience that they would never experience otherwise, and it's been very, very successful. They also have an office in Glasgow that supports the youth and poverty work of the Iona community, both through the organization and through individual members. It's kind of hard to explain how the Iona community really plays out, because so much of it is done by individuals, just ordinary people. There's about 300 members of the Iona community, almost entirely in the UK, and then there's another 1,500 associates around the world, and Bobby and I are two of those. But it's just ordinary people who believe that faith leads to action in daily life, and will explore that in their individual ways. One kind of classic example is this couple here. This is John and Molly Harvey, and they've been involved in the Iona community almost from the beginning. This is taken in their kitchen. Their home in Glasgow is always open to refugees and to asylum seekers, and really almost anybody else who needs a place to stay. You never know who you're going to find around their dining room table, but they are just the most incredibly wonderful people, and we've been very fortunate that they will not allow us to stay in a hotel anymore when we go to Glasgow. This is another couple. They're friends of ours, Robert and Alison Swinfen. They live in Glasgow, and they've also been members of the Iona community for quite some time. Robert was the business director of the Iona community, as Robert here. And then he moved on to become the director of Catholic Charities in Scotland. And his wife, Alison, is a professor at the University of Glasgow, and she holds the UNESCO Chair for Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts. And she's an acknowledged expert. She travels around the world lecturing and working for refugees and asylum seekers. They don't just do this in their work, they do it in their private life as well. Robert and Allison belong to a group called Positive Action for supporting and hosting refugees attempting to come into the UK. They became foster parents to a very lovely, about 10 years ago, a very lovely young woman named Rima, who had first just arrived from Eritrea. Now, I'd never heard of Eritrea, so I had to go look it up, and it's a small country on the Horn of Africa, just south of Sudan, with one of the worst human rights records in the world. So they've been trying at this entire time to try to get her family out of Eritrea and into the UK. They still have not been able to get them into the UK, but last year they were able to get them into Sweden, one or two at a time. And so here they are, just this past December, in Sweden, celebrating Christmas. And this is Rima's mom and her 6 siblings. And of course, Robert and Allison, and Rima's taking the picture. So Rima Robert and Allison put Rima through college, and she graduated with an engineering degree, and she's off on her own, but she has moved into a house very close by. And since they had an empty bedroom now, they have now taken in another refugee from Angola. And this is Dora. She is a sweetheart. She's from Uganda. She first came to IONA as a guest and then returned as a volunteer. And then after that, she came back again as a member of staff. So for the past few years, she's been on staff at the Abbey. And in Uganda, her family has a school for children with disabilities. And the toilet facilities consisted of a latrine pit. So inspired and supported by the IONA community, Dora decided that she was going to do something about that. And one of the first things she did was start to fundraise, and this was the fundraiser that she had. And this was actually, I think it might still be in the Welcome Center, right across the road from the Abbey. And because of her efforts, she was able to build 24 units. I think there were like 6 units for a total of 24 totally accessible toilets, and she's now working to continue to have the same thing happen at other neighborhood schools. So, unfortunately, we've lost Dora. She went back to Uganda in September, and when she was going to get married, and another member of the community, Chris Jones, had offered to make her wedding dress, and Dory said that she really wanted to have this dress that she had seen Kate, Prince William's wife, wear, which is not what Chris had in mind, but she made it work. So here's Dora in Uganda with her husband and her beautiful blue wedding gown. And there are hundreds upon hundreds of stories like this. Just ordinary people figuring out how to make a difference where they are, using what they have to work with. But IONA is not just about the Abbey or the IONA community. There's a lot of very special people who live their lives year in and year out there, and Bobby's going to be talking about that now.
So Phyllis has shared a little bit about the rebuilding, of course, of the actual cathedral in the 19th century under the Duke of Argyll, and then under George MacLeod in the 20th century, starting in 1938, the rebuilding of the old monastic building, and of course the Abbey itself. And then, of course, for the last 75 years, the Iona community, this religious community, has been carrying out the worship and the ecclesiastical and the ecumenical and the spiritual life of the Abbey and the cathedral itself on Iona. But of course, it's important to remember, there's not just the Iona community here, but the community of Iona on the island, who have been there for centuries and centuries. And so, fortunately for Phyllis and myself, back in 2012, when I retired from my first job as the director of the Carpenter's Boat Shop, and before I started my second job up here on the hill called Bowdoin College, Phyllis and I went to Iona for 3 months. We worked for the Iona community there at the Abbey and the Cathedral as volunteers. They call them residential volunteers. And so for 3 months, we volunteered our time and our labor for the Iona community. It was a wonderful kind of experience. Anyone can do it, but indeed we did go there for 3 months, and Phyllis volunteered in the kitchen. Every day, 300 meals are prepared in this little small kitchen for the 100 guests who are there every single week. And so Phyllis shared in the cooking and all the different kinds of activities there at the Abbey itself. And how did I volunteer? Well, when you're living in a building that's 800 years old, they need a lot of maintenance. And so I found myself volunteering in the maintenance department of the Iona community, doing all different kinds of jobs, like scraping 100 years worth of varnish off of the dining room tables and then revarnishing them. Also, I found myself repairing some of the pews that are almost 800 years old there in the ancient cathedral. I also had to rebuild the Bible book stand in one of the small chapels. And also, not a very good picture, but I had to repair the hinges on a door that was 400 years old. So it was really fascinating work. But literally the highlight of our time there on the island of Iona was being with the people in the community of Iona. They are, of course, the crofters or the farmers and the fishermen. Actually, I remember going there, as I mentioned, 50 years ago, and I became very good friends with one of the fishermen there, who unfortunately is no longer alive. But he took me out in his fishing boat, and I'll always remember it, especially because in his boat was the most beautiful prayer I've ever seen. And the prayer in his boat read, "Round this boat be God's aboutness, ere she try the depths of sea. Sea shall frail for all her stoutness, unless thou her helmsman be." I was so taken by that prayer that I said, if I ever build a boat, I'm going to put that prayer in that boat. And indeed, I'm very pleased to be able to tell you that now that little Iona prayer is in over 700 different boats built by the Carpenter's Boat Shop. Anyway, so what I'd like to do now, though, is just simply share with you a little bit about the people of Iona and the community that is there on Iona. And the way I'd like to do it is by simply introducing you to 3 individuals on the island of Iona, because these 3 individuals are about as typical and representative of any of the 150 people there are on the island of Iona. So the first person I'd like to introduce you to is Jane. Jane McFadden. Jane's life story is like reading a novel by Charles Dickens. You see, she was born 85 years ago. She wasn't born on Iona. She was actually born in the Orkneys on a little island called Westry. But tragically, when she was born 85 years ago, her mother died of childbirth, and for the first 4 years of her life, she was raised by her father, who was a fisherman there. He eventually, after 4 years, remarried another woman who deeply disliked Jane. And when she was only 14 years of age, was sent away from the family on Westry, all the way down to London to live with a distant relative. She worked down in London at a hotel there, but she just longed to get back to Scotland. And one day, she was reading a paper. She saw an advertisement for a job in the Columba Hotel on the island of Iona. She quickly applied, and she got the job. And so in 1968, she traveled from London to Iona and began working in the Columba Hotel. About a month after she was working there, into the hotel came a crofter, one of the farmers from the island, a man named Duty McFadden. and Judy McFadden ordered from Jane a cup of tea and a scone. Jane served them, and 1 year later, Judy and Jane were husband and wife. They lived in a little croft, right there, on the east side of the island. Judy raised his sheep and his cows there. 2 years later, Jane gave birth to a son named Logie McFadden. But sadly, only 17 years into their marriage, Judy contracted pancreatic cancer and died within the year. Nevertheless, Jane and her son, Logie, carried out the farming there on the island. But again, sadly, in December 3rd, 1998, Logie, when he was only 23 years of age, was crossing from was crossing from Iona across the Sound to Mull. He was going across there in an open boat with 4 other boys to go to a Calia dance over there on the island of Mull. They went across, and indeed, he built them that boat. Davy used that boat for 2 years, but then for some reason, he didn't use it for a number of months. And so a 15-year-old boy from the island of Iona went to Davy and said, "Noticed you weren't using your boat. Could I ever use it? You see, I want to start fishing, and it's the perfect boat for me to start my lobster fishing." Davy said, "Sure, go ahead, it's all yours." So he fished out of that boat for a full year. At the end of the year, the boy went back to Davy and said, "You know, this is just what I've always wanted to do. Could I ever buy your boat?" Davy said, "I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I'll have to think about it." He came back to the boy after a week, and he said, "I'm thinking about it a lot. I'm not going to sell you my boat. You see, what I'd like to do instead is to give you. I want to give you my boat on behalf of myself, and on behalf of my wife, Fiona, and on behalf of our late son, David Jr. You see, it was his son, who was also one of the other boys who died in that tragic accident in December of 1998. And so that young boy now is fishing out of that boat of Davy's, and he's a source and a wellspring of incredible hope and encouragement to see the next generation coming along to take their place there on the island. And the last family I'd like to introduce you to is this family. This is John McGinnis and his wife Jo, and their 2 sons, Angus and Alexander McGinnis. John is a 7th generation crofter, or farmer, as we would say. He's been farming ever since he was the age of those young boys, but at the age of 18, he thought, maybe I might not want to farm all my life. And so he decided he'd go to university. He went off to the university at the University of Glasgow, and it was there that he met Jo. They went there for 4 years, and at the end of their time, they were married. And they decided that instead of returning to the island, that they would take 7 years. 7 years to see if they prefer life on the mainland of Scotland. And so they worked in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and different places. But at the end of the 7 years, they both said to each other, you know, it's time to go home. And indeed they did. They went home to this lovely little farm, that little lovely farm on the west shore of the Isle of Iona. And indeed, they took up their farming, and they are now farming there with their 2 sons as well, right there on the Isle of Iona. And I remember being with John McGinnis last summer when Phyllis and I were last on the island. And we got chatting about all different kinds of things. And I asked John, how's the farming going? Oh, he said, it couldn't be going better. I said, you think you'll be doing this the rest of your life? And he turned to me and he just said to me, oh my, Pete, I'll be doing this until the day that I die. And when I die, I'm going to be buried in that ancient cemetery with the farmers and the fishermen, with the kings and the queens of Scotland. You see, he said, this land, this island for me, is sacred ground. And so, the island island of Iona continues to be sacred ground, holy ground, not just because of the great abbey and the cathedral that are there, but they continue to be sacred ground because of the mystical light that is always given off every day from the horizon. It's sacred ground because of the peace of the beautiful passions. It's sacred and holy ground because of the ancient walkways through the island. And it's sacred ground because of the beauty of where the beaches meet the sea. And it's sacred ground because of the daily setting of the magnificent sun beneath the horizon. And so as we part today from you, may I share with you just one last little prayer and blessing, because it's a blessing that comes from the island of Iona. And so to you all, may the peace of the deep waves be unto you. May the deep peace of the flowing winds be unto you. May the deep peace of the quiet earth be unto you. May the deep peace of the shining stars be unto you. And may the deep peace of God's peace be with you all this day and forevermore. Thank you all.